When you throw a pot, you finish the inside of it, but when you trim a pot, you finish the outside. Trimming can really make your pot look beautiful, but on the most basic level, it can simply get rid of unwanted extra clay and extra weight. This is Dan Vito at Fireborn Studios, and I'm going to show you how to trim pots while they're wet and on the wheel before you cut them off. This initial trimming while your pots are still on the wheel will rough out the shape and enable them to dry much more evenly. Later, when your pots are leather hard, you'll turn them upside down and trim them more to give them their final shape. You'll be using your metal loop tool or trim tools and your digger tool while the pots are still on the wheel. Here's the demonstration. I'm going to take 1.5 pounds of clay. First, I'm going to put a little water on the wheel. Then I'm going to throw the clay down. I'm going to smack it down good so it's stuck to the wheel. And then I'm going to tap from the side to get it into a slight dome shape. I want to make sure it's centered, and I'm using my finger to make a circle to see if it's good. In this clip, the clay isn't centered very well, so I'm going to stop the wheel and push it into the center, and then I'll continue. With beginners, this is what we often see. They've gone down inside and opened up a little bit, and they stop pretty much right there. It's got a U-shaped bottom, and it's sticking out here. Okay, they might get a little thinner, maybe like this. And the top looks pretty thin, but down here it's a good 1.5 inches thick. When you have a pot like this, you can get rid of a lot of this extra clay while it's still on the wheel. One thing you can do is take this tool and just push it in like that and just cut off extra clay. We can take this other tool and kind of do the same thing, but this time I'm going to start up here and I'm going to slide down and I'm going to follow the inside curve, because remember the inside curve is U-shaped, so I want to make the outside U-shaped. Now I'm going to cut down to the wheel and remove this extra clay. So immediately I've removed lots of clay, lots. The inside of this pot and the outside are now similar in shape. It's still too thick, it needs to be trimmed, but it's much better than it was. And I'm going to tell you right now, when it comes to drying pots, this is going to dry so much better than when it looked like this. So we're going to cut and take a look at the cross section. It's still too thick down here, but we can trim more off when we turn it upside down, when it's leather hard. Getting back to trimming pots while they're right side up and still attached to the wheel, you can see that we've managed to remove a significant amount of clay on the side of this pot, and now the outside of the pot mirrors the curve of the inside of the pot. Trimming is a way of making your pots functional, structurally sound, and aesthetically pleasing. Beginners have difficulty making pots with thin walls. Sometimes all they get is a lump of clay with a hole in the middle. But with time, you'll be able to pull your pots up higher and higher and get the walls thinner and thinner. This is 1.5 pounds of clay. Beginners sometimes stop when they get this much clay about 2 or 3 inches high. But in fact, with practice, you can get this 1.5 pounds of clay into a 7-inch tall cylinder. Watch while I fast forward through this sequence of throwing. When we look at a cross-section of this piece, the walls and the floor are fairly uniform in thickness. This pot will need more trimming. It doesn't need to be trimmed right now while it's vertical on the wheel, but it will need to be trimmed just a little bit upside down when it's leather hard. So to review, if your pot's only 1.5 inches, 2 inches, maybe 3 inches tall, and you've used 1.5 pounds of clay, it's definitely too thick. And what you need to do is trim off some clay while it's still on the wheel. And this is how you do it, and this is what it would look like. Of course, you wouldn't have your pot cut in half like this one is. Once you get your cut started, your trim tool should ride in that cut, and the cut should help keep your trim tool steady. This is a bowl shape. You can trim a little bit off of it while it's still attached to the wheel and right side up, but to get that raised foot, you need to do it when it's leather hard and upside down on the wheel. This is a typical beginner's pot. It's extremely thick on the bottom. This is mostly trimmed while it's right side up on the wheel, but it will need additional trimming when it's leather hard and upside down. This piece here is much better thrown, but it still needs a little bit of trimming, and this I would probably do when it's leather hard and upside down. This piece on the right shows how you could trim it and have a raised foot, and on the left it shows a beveled edge. Beveled edge is when you put a 45-degree angle cut at the foot of the pot, as you see here. And this is very helpful for terminating your glaze at the wax line, and you're going to learn more about that later. But don't leave a square edge at the foot of the pot. Always put a beveled edge or a raised foot. Now I've got a few more tips for beginners. When you're trimming a leather hard pot upside down on the wheel, you use the circles on the wheel to get the pot centered, and you can check it with your finger to see if it's really well centered. Then you take 3 little wads of clay and you're going to stick them to the wheel head. Now they don't stick to the aluminum very well unless you put a little water there. So I stuck my finger in a bucket of water and got a little water on the wheel head, not the pot, just the wheel head. And then I look down on this and I divide it into thirds, and I stick the 3 wads of clay down in thirds to anchor the pot. And then I can proceed to trim. I do the same thing with a cylindrical pot. I visually center it within the concentric circles on the wheel head. I check it with my finger, and then I make my little wads of clay. I'm going to put a little water on the wheel head around the rim of the pot, and then I'm going to hold the pot still while I stick the wads of clay down to the wheel head to secure the pot. And I'm holding the pot still while I do this so it doesn't get shoved off to the side while I'm sticking my clay wads down. I check to make sure the pot is truly centered, and then I can trim. Note the position of my left hand, which helps to anchor the pot, just in case it goes flying. And I'm putting a little bevel on the foot. Here's a close-up of that bevel. And I'm going to wax down to the beginning of that bevel. See the 45-degree angle? This is another thing that you need to understand. This pot, which I'm centering on the concentric lines on the wheel head, is centered on the bottom, but the top is not centered and it's not level, as you can see as it rotates and passes my finger. And what this means is that when you throw a pot like this, you only have one opportunity to get extra clay off of it, and that is while it's still stuck to the wheel when you first throw it. You can use either of those two tools because, as you can see here, when you turn it upside down, the bottom isn't level and it's not centered, and there's no way you can trim that. This pot has a fairly level lip, but it's a little bit too thin, and there's a chip out of the lip, and it's not quite level. So I'm going to show you what you can do when your pots are not level at the lip. Now, ideally, you should be doing this when you're throwing and the pot is stuck to the wheel and it's wet and soft. But if you don't get the top of the pot leveled up then, you can level it up now. So I'm sticking the pot down with some clay wads. Now I'm going to take my needle tool. I'm going to come in and trim the top off this pot. So I have to come in very slowly. And first I make a tiny little line, and then I press. And as I press, the needle stays in the groove that I've created and eventually cuts through the wall of the pot. Now, it takes some time for the needle to do that, and you have to be patient and try to maintain steady pressure. You can see the pot's leather hard, and the part that I cut off is pretty stiff. And now I'm just smoothing off the lip with the edge of the needle tool and rounding it a little bit. And this is much better than it was. So this is another technique that you can use to improve your pots and help with trimming. Because when I turn this pot upside down now, the lip will be level, so the foot will be level. In conclusion, I hope the techniques that I've been showing you will help you to trim your pots while they're still on the wheel before you cut them off, and later when they're leather hard and you turn them upside down and trim them some more. Remember, if your pots are too thick, we won't be able to fire them because they could blow up in the bisque kiln. This video and others can be found on our website and will help you with trimming, throwing, and glazing.